please mute, but don't mute mentally, because we have one of the most dynamic lawyers in the network on stand today. Eduardo Benavides from Berninzon Benavides in Lima, Peru. And his journey and what he gets involved with is extraordinary. Eduardo, we're going to start with a very simple opener, which is, how did you find your way to the law? Did you find the law, or did the law find you?
First of all, Keith, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think it would probably be the latter. I don't think I went chasing for law on purpose. Actually, after exiting high school and going into university, I was not 100% sure what road I wanted to take. I had a lot of areas where I had a lot of interest. For example, I loved history. I still love history, philosophy, and several other areas. So in Peru, when you go into university, the first 2 years, fortunately, you have what we call general studies, which is sort of liberal arts. So you take a lot of different subjects, and you are still to decide what faculty you will go in after the 2 years. So that was a good window in order to make my mind. But still, when I entered law school and I decided for law school, I was not 100% safe or secure about that decision. During my first year in law school, I still was attending some classes, for example, from the history faculty. And it was, I would say, some of the professors in law school, like my contract law professors, the one who made an influence in making my decision, which I do not regret one single day. Obviously, when I started practicing first as an intern in a law firm in Lima, that's when I really found love for my profession, and the journey has really been fantastic. When I entered law school, I remember I met one of my old teachers from high school, and he asked me what was I doing, and I told him I'm going to be a lawyer, and he was very disappointed. He looked back at me and he said, "Oh, you're disappointing me. You were a brilliant student," and he was a master in biochemistry, by the way. And he said, "I can't find something more boring and less inventive than law." I would be happy to report back to him these days and tell him he was completely wrong. Actually, the journey has been quite entertaining. I have met lots of people and I have been in fantastic places. And from the view I had when starting my studies of law to what I have been doing all these years, it has been surprisingly unexpected in a very positive way.
So let's pick up on that point then, Eduardo, that this contention that the law is boring, the law is restrictive, the law is not creative, and that lawyers are not creative, because you're one of the most creative people that I see around the network. And it's wonderful to hear you talk about the fact that the journey has been unexpected and full of surprises. So, maybe expand a little bit about that. I mean, and how do you keep the law fresh for yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the big advantages working as a lawyer in a law firm, and one of the things I enjoy most, is I have a lot of freedom in order to decide about my time, the matters I dedicate time to, and I have a lot of very diverse and interesting work. I'm never doing the same. I'm obviously in these times, of COVID-19, I'm spending more time here in home, sitting behind my computer. But my normal work was really very diverse from one day to the next one. And I was one day traveling to the US in order to meet a client. And then the next day I was sitting in a board of directors talking to high-level people. And then the next day I was negotiating something with the unions in Peru, or I was visiting a mine. So all this experience have obviously contributed quite a lot in my expertise. I spent my early years also as a lawyer working as in-house counsel for an international company. That was also a lot of that very interesting and very diverse work I have been doing. And as you were saying, there's nothing boring and there's nothing non-creative in working as a lawyer. Actually, the law brings us the beauty that you learn a lot about adapting and about changing things in your career. But the kind of stuff I did in my early years as a lawyer would be very different from the ones I have been doing in the last 5-6 years. I've been doing much more international arbitration, for example, in the 5-6 last years, which is something I didn't envision to do, for example, 10 or 15 years ago, when I was doing more transactional work, more M&As, more corporate work, or from the times I was closing transactions late in the evening and enjoying all that hype that normally goes around transactions.
So when you go back then to the beginning of your journey, you said when you first started out, actually the foundations of being a lawyer were there because you were keeping options open and you were looking at both sides. So clearly there's a sort of legal gene in there. In terms of what you imagined the journey was going to be like, and that sort of first job in-house to then moving crossing the line, if you like, compared to what you expected, what has the journey been like? And if you're going back to those early days, what are the key things that you can pull out and say, that's what I learned that I've taken with me into the latter stages?
That's a very good question. I think, I spent my first 10 years as a lawyer working for a chemical international company, one of the blue chips of the international world. And it was a fantastic experience. I learned a lot there about law, but especially about dealing with people, how a big international company works, and a lot about the corporate world. I actually, during that time, spent time not only in Peru, but I spent a couple of years in Germany working with a company. I traveled a lot to places like Mexico and Argentina. This company was very good in training young people, so I benefited a lot from that, especially soft skill training, management, financial work, and things like that, which are things that normally a lawyer doesn't get in his skill tool set. So that experience, when I left the company, became very, very valuable and was appreciated a lot by clients because my first years with this company, it was 100% legal work. But then when I had graduated from law school and when I started growing in the company and became the chief of the legal department, my boss, who was a German, and he was a very funny guy, he invited me one day for lunch. He told me, what do you plan to do the next 20 years of your life? Because you can continue to be the chief, the legal counsel of the company, but I think you have some talent that we can take advantage of, and we can train you to become also an executive of the company, doing other things. And I remember I answered him, but I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about management. I only know about being a lawyer. And he answered me back, well, remember one thing, this is a chemical company, and I know nothing about chemicals. And I am the CEO of this company. I'm successful. And what this company has done for me, which is what I plan to do with you, is they have trained me in taking decisions. And that was one of the reasons years later, they moved me to Germany. And that was also a chance for me to pursue further master studies in Germany. And I stayed with the company for a while there. And they did a fantastic thing because they make what they call a job rotation plan. So they made me go through different stages in different departments of the company. The company was huge. They had 50,000 workers, employees working for the company. So you can imagine each of these departments was big enough to give me work and to train me, and they were very dedicated in that. So after that time, I obviously had acquired a number of other abilities, which later on, when I was working as a partner in my office, they proved to be quite invaluable, because many times I was able to establish good connections with clients, because they told me, you speak our same language. You know the corporate world, you know how companies think. You are not giving me the answers I normally get from my lawyers. You really understand what the decision-making process is like in an international company. So that was obviously a huge benefit in terms of creating long-term trustful relations with clients.
So, Eduardo, that was really a foundation for you. And as you say, you gained a lot of commercial, corporate skills, people skills, negotiation skills, client orientation skills. The group of lawyers we've got on the call today are obviously not in that position, not at the moment. They're not in-house. They're all working for Mackrell International law firms. So what advice could you share with them in terms of how do they start to get that understanding of what clients want and what clients need? How do they engage without leaving their firms and going in-house? Because then I'll get into a lot of trouble if we encourage that, and we have an exodus of bright up and coming Mackrell International lawyers. What would you say?
Well, I understand that completely, and there are, fortunately, working with clients is also a learning experience, and it allows us to really sit down with the clients and tell them, I need to understand your business in order to be able to give you good advice. And really, clients enjoy that. They appreciate very much when you try to understand about the specific business, be it telecommunications, mining, or finance, that the client is involved in, and sharing ideas about what are their expectations, what's the business plan, and so on. During these years, I not only learned a lot about the chemical industry. I worked in huge projects internationally. Some of them were in mining. Some of them were in telecommunications. There was one time when telecommunications was booming here in Peru, and we had all the major international players coming in order to buy spectrum or buy operations of companies. And I remember at that time I was a young associate in a law firm. And my boss came one day and said, we don't have a telecommunications expert, so you will become our telecommunications expert. You have 3 days. We have a meeting with a client next Monday, so please become an expert until next Monday. And I took that as a challenge, and I started from scratch, studying the law, getting into details. But obviously, the best experience is when you talk to clients and learn about the business. Working with these telecommunication companies, I would sometimes ask them, can I go to your site? Can I go and see how is it operating in the ground? Can I look at your tower sites or at your city gate or your main center and try to understand through the engineers, how is this working, how your network will develop? And they were normally very gracious in conceding that and saying, we like that. We like that you will learn our business. And that proved also to be quite valuable. The clients open doors, sometimes sitting in the board of directors of a company, some other times working in an offering of notes internationally. They open a lot of doors that you should use in order not to become an expert, but to become familiar with the activities of your client. And that is something that they really appreciate.
And interestingly, that's a common theme right the way through our mentor series, where the mentors before you, whether they've been from the US or Asia, Europe, have all said something similar, which is, number one, say yes to things. You know, what's the worst that can happen? And number two, and be curious. And number two is get under the skin of what your client does. You know, Alison, who's on the call today and who did the last one, talked about, you know, you're not just there to give a legal opinion. You know, actually go beyond that. And that's what you're saying as well, Eduardo. But I presume as well that means you need to be in a firm that isn't so rigidly hierarchical and structured, where the partners allow you the scope and freedom to go and ask those questions, because it will give a benefit not just to the client, because that's what the client wants to see and hear, but actually to the firm. Yeah. And how do you encourage that within Berninzon Benavides?
Well, we try to create opportunities for our young associates to meet clients. Sometimes we make presentations from clients, especially when they have new projects. Like if I have a new client and he's coming to Peru to open a school or to launch a new product or to start an interesting infrastructure project, we invite them many times to speak, and we do a lot of that also cooperating with other institutions such as chambers of commerce, for example, or think tank groups. And that has a double benefit, because on one side, our client feels that we are long-term partnering with them, that we are helping them actually start with a good foot in the country, and that we are really committed with their long-term projects. And on the other side, obviously, that is a good training tool with our lawyers. The more they learn about what are the expectations of the client, the better they will be able to react. The more they know about the particulars of this business project, the more they will be ready and well equipped in order to serve the client and in order to understand why is the client concerned with certain issues that normally for a lawyer wouldn't be material. So creating this environment for clients to mingle with our lawyers And sometimes we do it also in a very social way. When obviously we didn't have the lockdowns, I used to do a lot of entertaining in my house or in my club, and organize also drinks after office or that kind of stuff, which we obviously enjoy very much in this part of the world. Sometimes watching a football game, or getting around food and drinks, which is things that people really enjoy. And that must be obviously tailor-made for clients. There are clients who like working until late, so for some of them it will work better if it's an early breakfast. There are others who will tell me, no, I want to discuss this matter, so I want to socialize after 5. I need to get out of the office and share good jokes with you guys and talk about other things. And these kind of social events are also very good for talking about politics and football, but also for learning a lot about the inside of the business and of the mindset of the people who are running the business.
So we can't do that at the moment.
Yeah.
In fact, is anybody on the call? No, maybe in Malaysia, maybe Amanda. I'm not sure, but there's a few little parts of Asia Pacific and a couple of parts of Africa where there is no lockdown. But how are you replicating that at the moment, Eduardo? What are you doing to try and facilitate conversations with clients and facilitating your younger lawyers connecting with not just partners, but actually with clients?
Well, we are doing obviously a lot of these Zooms and these video chat conferences, or sometimes just informal video chats. We have one which is weekly, which we normally do with clients. We are doing one tomorrow, actually, with an Italian company. And we have decided that we are doing a wine tasting with them. So it will be 6 p.m. tomorrow. And it has become very popular, for example, because you have the wine tasting for about half an hour or whatever. And then there's a lot of cheap talk about different things, but also normally something on the legal side that we will brief them about something, or that we will ask them. We will have 2 Italian clients in this, so everything is about Italian wine. But we will also look for this opportunity. We will have at least 10 lawyers from the office in this one. And we will look also to learn a lot about what these 2 companies who are newcomers in Peru will be planning to do. How will they like us to help them? That's one question I normally try to ask them from the very beginning. What can we do in order to contribute with value to your business? So what do you expect from us? What can we do in order to make this project be successful? And normally, of course, in these chats, it's not the same as we are meeting in person, but they usually go quite well. Clients feel that we really have an interest in knowing them, and that we are willing to find opportunities for them to succeed, to network, to properly connect.
You've touched on Italy, Germany. I'm going to come back and talk about your international connections and how you've built them and how you manage them. But just before we do that, coming back to, I suppose, the young lawyers that have come up through your firm, and you're an experienced lawyer now. Let's put it that way. You've seen a few waves of young lawyers come through in your time. On the one hand, what impresses you about an up and coming lawyer when you see them doing something or in the way that they act, and what frustrates you as a general thing, and do you then intervene and guide them differently?
Well, obviously, my impression, and I'm also a law professor, so I interact quite a lot with young people, young students, and I'm always impressed with how smart, well prepared, well connected with the world the younger generations are. They know everything about what is going on, and they are very demanding in terms of wanting things done immediately, and that is at the same time sometimes frustrating. I have a young son who is in law school, and normally he wants things for today. And when I explain him that it took me months or years to achieve what he wants for today, he doesn't get it. When I talk him also about the times when I was a struggling student in a poor country, he doesn't buy the story, because things since then have improved quite a lot in Peru, and the chances today of getting a good job, for example, are way better than the ones I had when I was young and going out of law school. So the demand in terms of getting things solved or sorted right away, that is one of on the so-called negative side, that is one of the things I normally see in young people, but I understand it completely. I was also very demanding when I was young, and some of the mistakes I made in my younger days were because of being impulsive and probably not keeping track or taking good care of good manners, or having a soft hand in certain situations. But at the same time, the young generations have a lot of advantages. Language skills, for example, I see that young people nowadays, they will have full command normally of 2 or more languages. That was not the case in my times as a young attorney. And actually for me, it was a huge advantage commanding 3 languages, Spanish, English, and German, because many times in the office, I was the only one not only speaking German, but also speaking fluent English. And so all the English-speaking clients, they went to my desk, and I was getting all the extra work that other lawyers couldn't do. It's not the case nowadays. I'm always fascinated how good young people are in languages, and I will encourage each of our young lawyers in Mackrell to continue that path and to continue learning languages, because that's always a huge investment.
I'll just pick up on that for a second then. Can you just put into the chat, if you speak another language, just pop it into the chat, and if it's brought you, you know, a multicultural client, or if you're working with clients in more than one language, then put that into the chat. I know that I am, and Eduardo corrects me on my Spanish, for improvement, of course, as do the other Latin Americans.
Spanish is great. You have a little Chilean accent, but it is great.
Thanks, Eduardo. The check's in the post. So let's come back then to just before we move on, before we go international, and talk about that tension between, putting it far too simplistically, but between a young and driven and ambitious and demanding and time-pressed new wave of lawyers who probably see the experienced lawyers as a little bit, you know, a little bit slow, you know, maybe a little bit obstructive because they're not responding so quickly, and the experienced lawyers who as you said, are looking and thinking, well, I could give you the answer to that, but you really need to build it and learn it. You need to own it as part of your experience for it really to be something that you can put into your professional toolbox. Otherwise, it's going to be forgotten. How do you manage that tension? Because I'm thinking about that in terms of your role as a professor of law at the university as well. And how do you manage that?
Well, it's not easy. I had my young son. I had him as an intern in the office during one summer.
That's
and,
brave.
Yeah, and he was like that every single day. I will give him something, and he's very smart actually, and he will be a very good lawyer. But I will give him something to do, and he will be back in 1 hour and tell me, "This is done. Give me more." And then when we went through what he had done, something like a legal brief, a letter, a report, there were obviously loops, and I was telling him, "You haven't looked deeply into this, and you haven't looked deeply into that." That's part of the process. I think probably all our colleagues here will agree that you don't come out of law school without practical experience, and you will be a great lawyer the first day. Many of the things that have been so important in my training during these years didn't come from law school. They came from practical experience. So I always tell my young associates, take the advantage of every single minute you spend in our office. Our work is very international, so that is an extra source of experience. Because a lot of the things I learned from my bosses in law firms when I was young, they have been much better than any of the best classes in law school. Dealing with clients, negotiating, learning about the personality of your counterparty in the negotiation table, getting your elevator speech before a meeting, a lot of that stuff, creating your brand as a lawyer, marketing your services. A lot of that stuff, there are some conferences that obviously you can access in the web, but a lot of that came from practical situations, came from me messing a meeting and then my boss calling me to his office and telling me, "Listen, this is what you need to do. You need to start attending social functions where you meet business people and where you start to market yourself." And I will answer, why do I need to do that? Because that's nothing that has to do with legal. And he will explain me why. And he will tell me sometimes, listen, even don't sit in the last chair of the meeting. Sit in the first one, because people need to notice that you are there and you need to show around, and people will stick to you when they say, "I like this guy because he's present in the picture." So a lot of those very simple and sometimes just good rational or common rational tips came from those situations, and I continue to appreciate what that meant to me. Many times when they came and I was young and impulsive and willing to go through the doors of the next stage as quick as possible, I wouldn't appreciate them, and I thought, well, that he's telling me that because his experience was different. But then through the years, it really has become very, very valuable.
So, who were your mentors along the way, and do you still have mentors? Because you're still young.
Yeah, I still have mentors. I still have good friends who I will turn to. Some of them are retired. Some of them are close to retiring or are in senior positions in the industry or in law firms. And I will, when I have complicated situations, especially dealing with personal situations or where situations where emotions are involved, I will turn to them and ask them, what would you do? And they are always very gentle in coaching me with respect to how to react. I had very good bosses, all of them very demanding, some with very strong personalities, and most of them also, besides being bright legal minds, they had a very good set of skills and abilities in terms of getting clients, marketing services, dealing and treating clients. Some of them made mistakes, which I realized at that time, and I tried to correct through the years. I remember when I was still a young lawyer, one of my bosses, who was an old partner in a big law firm in Lima, he invited a client for lunch. And after the lunch, he sent the bill to the client for the client to pay. I realized that the reason for that is that he was also the chair of the board of directors of the client. So probably he was feeling this company is partly my company. But that was a big mistake. And I realized that almost immediately, because the CEO of the client, who was an American, he became very pissed with that situation. And he thought that he was taking advantage of it, but it was not polite at all. And I agree with that. And I have tried during years to be very sensitive with that kind of stuff, with the feelings and emotions of the client. When the client sometimes comes to the office or he calls and he's like yelling because he's upset about something, I always try to listen behind the hard words. What is he trying? What message is he trying to convey? What is he trying to tell me? And most times the reactions of young lawyers are also emotional. This guy is completely crazy. He's yelling me for something that is not my mistake. And once you dig into the problem, you realize that really he's not yelling at you. He's just desperate because he will not be able to meet his budget figures during this year. He's in risk of being fired. He's not going to be able to spend the holidays with his family, and he had planned for vacations in Aruba, or whatever other reason that really is creating a complete storm around him. It's only when you dig into that sort of psychological stuff that you are really able to understand the client and get the solution to him in a different way.
There you go, Zen mastery from Eduardo. I bet you weren't expecting that on today's call. Thanks, Eduardo. I said we'd come back to the international side. Now, what's fascinating, or one of the many fascinating things about you, is the fact that, and forgive me, I'm going to get this wrong, but you are sort of on the board and involved with the German Chamber of Commerce, the British Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce. I've seen you do and actively post on LinkedIn about business that you're doing with Japan, and with the Japanese Chamber of Commerce, with the Swiss Chamber of Commerce. So there's clearly a theme going on here about using the embassies and the chambers to become a liaison point and undoubtedly to get work. How did that start, and how have you built that, and how do you manage that?
Thank you, Keith. Yes, one of the key building stones of my development as a lawyer has been on the networking side, and I took that quite seriously since a long time ago. I realized when I finished my stint with this German company. Actually, one of the huge advantages I had is I didn't come from a German background, but this German company when they decided they wanted to make me an executive, they sent me to learn German, and they paid for that, and they even paid for German classes when I was in Germany, and I was able to learn, which was not easy, and that became also an advantage. When I started building my portfolio of clients, I realized that I had an advantage in language, because German, Austrian, and Swiss companies, they like having and working with German-speaking lawyers. So part of my efforts since then became on getting a German client base and for getting involved with these institutions. And I learned also that the German clients, same thing, Austrians and Swiss, they are quite very loyal. Once they are fond of you, once they trust you, they will stay you almost forever. And many of my clients have been with me since a long time ago. Many times I was questioned by lawyers, other friends, and also younger lawyers in the office. Why do you do that? Why do you go regularly to these dinners and cocktails and functions with embassies and with chambers of commerce? They get a lot of good, valuable time from you that you could be spending with friends and family. Certainly, many of these people in these institutions have become close friends. You will see them in my house when I celebrate my birthday. But obviously, I also enjoy quite a lot of this social thing, which I'm missing a lot these days. And one of the things I'm very grateful with my career is that so many fantastic places I have been able to visit. There are so many different countries and fantastic people I have been able to meet. When I invite clients or friends to my office and they get into my office, they suddenly realize I have some pictures in my office and they say, hey, is that you with Bill Clinton? Or is that you sitting next to Paul Bocuse, the French chef? Or is that you with Carlos Slim or with Messi? All that was possible because of these social gatherings that my legal work was able to open doors for me. We lawyers normally, and that I speak in first person, we normally disregard a lot what it means to establish good long-term relations with people. We are normally rigid and not very flexible in terms of that. And that's something each of us, we can work at that. I was not a social person from the very beginning. I worked a lot on improving my social skills, my communication skills. And now I really enjoy it. I'm not suggesting that you should go to the pub every day and have 5 or 6 beers. I'm really saying that it is about creating a good balance between personal and family life and your professional and social life. But obviously, these situations, they create trustful and long-term relations. Many of the pitches for new business I have gotten, they were around the table, sitting in one of these meetings in the British Chamber of Commerce, or when the Lord Mayor of London came to Lima, and I was asked by the embassy to take him for golf on a Saturday because he's a complete crazy fan of golf. And during those head-to-head meetings, when you are completely relaxed, you get some of the best pieces of advice or some of the best insight or leads that you can get from these guys who sometimes they will not give you immediate work, but then 2 years later, be patient with that. You will get a call back, and you will get something like a big mandate for a huge project. I remember when I was young associate in an office in Lima, and I realized that my boss was late for a meeting, and two young American lawyers were waiting for him in the lobby of the office. And they waited for about an hour, and I decided to go there and have just a chat with them. They told me, we are short of time and we are going to the airport after this meeting, but we want to stop somewhere and have a sandwich. And I told them, there is a coffee shop around the corner. I will take you there. Make sure you get your sandwich, and then you take your taxi to the airport. And they were so thankful for that. They wrote me back. 2 years later, one of my best clients went from one of these guys. He was a partner in an office in New York, and he sent me one of the best clients I've ever had. They had a huge telecommunications project, and I was the leading counsel for the whole Latin American region in that project. So as someone told me once, the people that, and I think this is a phrase from Jack Nicklaus, a golfer, the people you're going to meet up the hill are the same guys you're going to meet down the hill. And I think those are the kinds of wisdom tips that I think will always come back to you.
So as a strategy then for young lawyers, I mean, one, think long term. Don't, and I guess this comes back to what we were saying earlier as well. Don't always expect immediate results, and allow relationships to flourish. It's not always about the pitch and go. It's about getting to know people who will then come back to you at some point and say, because I know you, because I trust you, I've got this situation. Can you help with it? Because I guess you're not going round the embassies, going, how can I be of value to you? You're just going to these functions and getting to know people. And clearly you're also hanging around lobbies looking for hungry expatriate lawyers, which we started this conversation talking about sandwiches, and clearly sort of food is as has been put in the chat, is the universal driver of business.
Yeah.
So the question that everybody wants to know is what advice did you give to Bill Clinton?
Bill Clinton is a fantastic guy. I'm not into politics on this, Democrats and Republicans, but he's a fantastic guy. Bill Clinton has a foundation, the Bill Clinton Foundation, and we were able to represent the Bill Clinton Foundation. So he used to come to Peru from time to time in order to promote some of the work they were doing with indigenous communities in the Andes. And I was able to meet him and know him quite well. He's an incredible personality. Actually, he also introduced me to Carlos Lim, which I managed also to know and to do work for him. But some other times meeting these people, that was a consequence of some of the functions, or for example, one of our clients also organized, they had a huge worldwide submarine cable project. And they invited us to New York for the kickoff of the whole project. And we met George Bush, the father, late George Bush, another very interesting personality. And George Bush was a speaker in that kickoff. And he made a lot of questions about the project, about which submarine cable was going to be used for. And that was before the offering, the international offering that they were making. So Bush actually, very smart, he asked to be that part of his fees for that conference would be paid in stock of the company. And he said, I'm going to show you I trust this idea. Well, he earned a lot of money with that. The company actually, the stock of the company went skyrocket after the offering. Bush sold at the right time, and he earned quite a lot of benefits from that transaction. One of the things I have enjoyed quite a lot is obviously meeting these hotshot guys, but also learning a lot of different people. I value very much the interculturality, and I think that is also an important value in international lawyers. That means learning about the perspective that each different country, culture may have approaching, for example, the negotiation of a contract. The approach of the Japanese or approach of the Germans or the Americans or the Latinos, the South Americans can be quite different one to the other. And I think something that helps a lot in terms of giving proper counsel, advising clients, making clients obviously also understand what they need to understand when negotiating with, for example, a Peruvian counterparty. It's about the cultural stuff. It's about the sort of things that you manage very well, Keith, because you are a man of all seasons and someone who has a foot in each side of the Atlantic. You will agree that having a good understanding of those concerns and of those cultural barriers is also quite important.
Definitely, and it comes back to your philosophy of being curious, getting involved, getting to know people, asking questions, and not just in terms of the client, but cross culturally, and you know that's why it's fantastic to be running this mentor series and have you know, Indiana, Kenya, Argentina, London, Hong Kong, Toronto, Malaysia, Pittsburgh involved, because you know we are truly multicultural and we learn from each other, which is fantastic. We're coming up to the hour. I have two final questions, but if anybody else has questions for Eduardo, as I said, pop them into the chat or give me a wave and unmute. One of the things I saw you do, you're a bit of a movie buff, and you posted on LinkedIn about you know, in lockdown when things were tough, you were being a little light amongst all of this sort of wonderful you know, legal postings and all of this cross-cultural reference. You talked about, you know, great lawyer movies. So the question for you is, which fictional movie lawyer or literary lawyer would you want to play Eduardo Benavides in the movie of your life?
Yeah, that's a good one, because there are quite a number of fantastic characters. Obviously, to give a little bit of background in this, I was invited to make this speech in one of our clubs, the Phoenix Club. It's actually an old British club here in Lima, and during the pandemic, we are doing virtual meetings with one speaker once a week. And I noticed most of my lawyer members of the club were doing very boring English legal speeches about complicated taxes and other stuff. So I decided to do something more on the funny side. I made a compilation of clips from something like 12 movies, all of them big legal movies. And I did a presentation, explained the movies, and although the people became crazy, we have a huge attendance. They want me to do the second part now. And as Kit was saying, I placed that in LinkedIn. I had more likes and people following that than any legal posting I had made in the last 2 years. And everybody was asking for the link in order to watch that presentation. And most of those movies, they are legal. They are trial lawyers defending the client before the jury. And I'm sure for many of you and for me, our first approach to the legal profession was through the movies or TV series. One of these fantastic, idealistic lawyers, like the character of Denzel Washington defending Tom Cruise in Philadelphia, for example, or for the older ones, the character of Gary Cooper, for example, in To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was sort of the view I had also in my early days when I wanted to become a lawyer. I wanted Eduardo Benavides to be one of these Al Pacino characters, or Paul Newman in The Verdict characters, that will tell people that justice is not the building, that justice is what is being made right now. And I'm happy that many of my good experiences, I'm not a trial lawyer, I'm more a corporate lawyer. I do a lot of arbitration nowadays, which is closer to becoming a trial lawyer. And especially in arbitration, one of the nice things I am able to touch and sense is justice being made, which is one of these phrases from these movies. Is having the opportunity to influence in the ruling, and having the opportunity many times also to influence in new legislation, because sometimes these rulings become quite influential in drafting of new legislation. I have been fortunate to become a sort of a senior expert in international arbitration. I'm doing work about that in Peru and in other countries. And one of the things I enjoy a lot about the work of being an expert witness in international arbitration is precisely the role model, precisely the opportunity that you will be cross-examined by the arbitrators, by both parties, and you will be in the spotlight, and you will have the opportunity to make an oral defense and to debate with the lawyer that is cross-examining you about the facts and about the law. In that experience, I interact a lot with some of the great international arbitrators from France, Spain, or the UK, and that is also an invaluable source of experience and motivation. Because we're talking about people that are the sort of sacred cows of international arbitration, and I normally appreciate a lot also what I learn from them.
Thank you, Eduardo. You also, in a very lawyer way, sort of slightly ducked the question, but I'm putting Al Pacino in touch. Does anybody have any questions before I ask my final question and we wrap up? Now look what you've done to them, Eduardo. You've blown them away. Their minds are full. Okay, this is the last question. I'm going to give you a time machine, bright green Mackrell International time machine, and you can go back to a point in your sort of young associate days or your young lawyer days, and step out and go, hey, Eduardo, a word of advice. Take this on board. What would you say to your younger self that might resonate with our up-and-coming lawyers today?
There is more than one word, but one, I think if I go back to, for example, my 20s, I remember during that time, and this was probably not the best advice, but the sort of, this was a very fascinating time in terms of business in Peru, because we were just opening the economy. So actually, corporate work was booming. We had a lot of M&As, foreign investment. The country had just opened, so foreign investment was rushing into the country. We were also having privatization of state-owned companies in different industries. And you can imagine, I was working 14 hours a day, getting back home at night, My wife wasn't very happy with that, of course. My desk was full of new cases and new clients being opened. And the full focus of the office at that time was get new clients, treat well clients. But part of the kind of standard of lawyer they wanted us to be was a very aggressive lawyer. You should show how aggressive you are and how strong you are in fighting with lawyers from other offices, with the lawyer of the counterparty when you are at the table of negotiations. And that is something, if I go back in time, I would tell people, be sure to treat well with respect your colleagues, your peers in the legal profession. And that's something that I think it's not very different nowadays. I still many times get into how poor the social skills of lawyers are. Some people say that that is because our brain structure or mindset coming from the legal profession or whatever. But I learned through years and sometimes with pain that there is one time when nobody will be there for you but your peers, your colleagues. And my colleagues have become through the years sources not only of referrals, cross referrals and clients, but also big sources of support, of assistance, of help. And this kind of fraternity and cooperation, for example, in my work nowadays as expert in international arbitration, my referrals come more and more from colleagues and friends in the legal profession. And you don't need in order to be strong in defending your position in a trial or in a negotiation to be disrespectful or to look over the shoulder to a younger lawyer or to an older lawyer, because sometimes I noticed that it was a young lawyer thinking, this old guy, old school, he's already old-fashioned, he doesn't know what is going on. That is probably my final piece of advice, because it still haunts me back from time to time.
I would say wise words to finish on. And again, echoing what you said about the people you meet going up the hill are the people you meet on your way down. So it doesn't cost very much to be kind and respectful, even if you're in an adversarial position. Adversarial doesn't mean disrespectful. Eduardo, it's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure.
I trust that everybody on the call today, you've taken something from that. I think there are lots of words to take on board and for us to live by. So, muchísimas gracias, Eduardo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We got another vote. Not Al Pacino, Javier Bardem for you.
Yeah. I will send you the link for my next movie, legal movies presentation. And thank you all for attending. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.